So I entitled my presentation "Old Wines, New Bottles," basically, because we say that we are living in an era of crisis. And at this moment, we are looking back at what has worked and how what has worked for several centuries can also help us to deal with the multiple crises. Just a clarification, I think when we started to talk about this conference, I was still working for FAO. I'm not working with them anymore. Now I'm working with a coalition that is a coalition of indigenous organizations that is called Land is Life. And I'm working or directing, supporting the efforts on food sovereignty. But also I'm an associate researcher of the Intercultural Maya University of Quintana Roo. For those that might not know what intercultural means, it means basically an educational system that has tried to brought together indigenous knowledge or an indigenous vision or a type of education that fits indigenous realities, because most of the educational systems have been shaping our territories and have been teaching us things that do not necessarily fit our contexts. Okay, let's start. So every time I talk to people, I tell them that I like them to think of a food that you might not like. Could be, if you go to Oaxaca, might be a grasshopper because we eat grasshoppers, or if I take you to the Peruvian Amazon, could be a suri, like this worm that you see there. So several years ago, I was in the Amazon, and one of the indigenous leaders, an Awahon leader, told me that many times when we design a policy that is linked to food, we do not understand the local contexts. I was asking you to think of a food that you don't like, because what he did was to take these worms to the Minister of Social Development in Peru and told the minister, I got you a present. And the minister screamed and said, oh, what is this? What do you want me to do with this worm? And the indigenous leader said, this is my food. I got you a present. And the way you react is the way I feel when you get me foods that I do not like and that do not fit what I want to eat. When we talk about the right to food, we say that cultural appropriateness, it's one of the dimensions that we should be addressing. But generally, that's a dimension that is neglected. So let me take you to another example. Several years ago, I was working for a food security program in Mexico. And the narrative of the project was, if we want to increase the food security, we need to increase the maize production. Like assuming people was eating only maize. So we went to one of the indigenous areas in a hilly part in Chiapas. And one scientist asked me, why is that people is planting maize with so much space? You could see a group of maize plants 1 meter apart from the other. I just responded because it's a milpa. Later on, the scientist came back and told me, according to the rationale of the project or the objectives of the project, what we had to recommend to these farmers was to change the seeds they had because it's inefficient, to change the planting density, which means not putting the plants every meter, but instead every 30 centimeters. But when he talked with the farmers or the indigenous people living in that area, he learned that people did not only eat maize. They needed pumpkins, they needed the beans, they had trees in the milpa, so they could also eat the fruits from there. But also thinking that the system had a more complex way or holistic way of working. So for those that have ever cropped, if you know, beans need a plant to climb when they grow. So maize provides that part. The pumpkin or squash helps to reduce the erosion with the leaves, wind or water. So there's a lot of richness in this system that because many of us as experts do not understand the rationale, like us when we're working in this project on food security, we were coming and trying to impose a new reality. So this is interesting because when we talk about food systems, generally when we talk about the mainstream food systems, we talk about food production. Whereas with indigenous peoples' food systems, we talk about food generation, and I will explain what's the difference. When we say crop production, then we think about the amount of water we put or the seed that we put, the amount of surface that we use, and how much we can get per unit of this. So you focus on productivity. Whereas when we talk about food generation, I was describing just this beautiful milpa system. But people do not only eat maize. They also eat other things that they have in the milpa system. If you are in my hometown, for example, you also live from the forest. You harvest mushrooms in the rainy season. If you are in other areas, you might have potatoes if it's cold. So you see that each of these systems are adapted and are not necessarily looking for the efficiency in terms of yield per unit of something, but instead what is that we need through the season to make a living. So this also takes us to say that the main food systems or the conventional food systems have made us rely on tree crops. You that live in Europe probably were more familiar with the whole situation with the war in Ukraine, right? And how that affected the rising prices. So we rely mainly on wheat, on maize and rice, and they give us the 60% of the caloric intake. So when we saw COVID, when we saw this war, when the markets disrupt and affect any of these crops, then we are in a strong pressure because then we are relying so heavily on these crops that our food security can be affected. Whereas when we talk about indigenous peoples' food systems, we have documented, FAO has documented that there are some food systems that can have even 400 different crops in just one single system. Can you imagine just relying on tree crops versus the richness of 400 different plants in just one single system? This is also going to take us to another reflection. The mainstream food systems are the main contributors to the greenhouses gas emissions, which is the 30%, but also they cause 80% of the deforestation in the world. So we're seeing that this conventional way of cropping, it's also damaging our environment. But what has happened in policy for many, many years, in Mexico, there's an author that it's called Jonathan Fox, and he says that policy has mainly subsidized inequality because they have looked at the rationale of productivity, saying we need to increase productivity, monocropping, whereas it has put behind some other systems. We can reflect on the Green Revolution, for example, that was a model that was implemented in many regions of the world. But also the richness of indigenous peoples' food systems, when we talk about these technologies or why people reflect on why the Green Revolution wasn't so effective everywhere, is because the seeds needed special conditions, right? Whereas indigenous peoples have adapted. We say they are the guardians of biodiversity because they have been able to develop so much knowledge in the areas where they live that they can live in the Arctic, that they can live in the desert, or we can think of the pastoralist communities in the sub-Saharan Africa. For example, you that live in Europe, maybe some of you take vitamin D in winter because you don't have enough light. But if you go to the Selkirk people in Siberia, for example, they would tell you that they eat lots of fish so they can compensate, or they have specific diets that can help them to compensate for some of these nutrients they need. I was giving you the example of the worm at the beginning because something that has happened with many of the food systems of indigenous peoples is that when many of us come as experts, we tend to say their foods are minor. How is that they could be eating this? This is not safe. And then we tend to impose many other things. When in reality, these systems are more sustainable many times. Like I said, they don't deplete resources because then you're following, according to the season, what you have in your environment. But also the culture of waste is less. Let me give you an example. In my community, when we make rituals, because we have our sacred places, we use eggs and we offer chickens and we have like a whole fest for a week. The first day we will eat the eggs that we use for the ritual. The second day we will have the big fest and we prepare something that we call caldo mije and we make some tamales. The third day with the remaining caldo mije, which is like a soup or a stew, we make tamales. And the fourth day, we continue turning this food into something else till we finish everything. So you see this idea of circularity or reducing the waste. It's so important to us. And I'm saying this because 30% of the food that is generated in the world, when we think of what you eat, you produce in the field and take to your plate, 30% of that food gets wasted. So one of the challenges that we always get now, you heard that I'm in the Vatican because they have something that is called the Pontifical Academia of Science. And this is the first time they are having a dialogue to recognize the value of indigenous people's knowledge here. And we are having a discussion on how these different types of knowledge can converge. And some people call our knowledge as indigenous peoples minor, because they say we haven't structured it in the same way like conventional science work. But I tell these people, imagine that we don't make registrations in the same way that the conventional science does. Nevertheless, people have developed really good technology, like a seed, for example. I like giving this example of the cajete system in La Mixteca, Oaxaqueña, because it's a super dry area and they dig holes up to 30 centimeters. They put the seed there. They use the humidity that is remaining really deep, or they also sow the maize along the streams. When the rain comes, because it's little rain, they will know that it will manage to irrigate a bit of that seed. So these seeds have been adapted to this specific type of soils. When I think of my community, I know that in some regions of my community, they can have 2 cropping seasons per year, and they have developed the seeds for that part. But they also have developed seeds that are better for a higher altitude where you have winds. So this is also another way of producing knowledge. It hasn't been registered in the same way, but it's also technology that has allowed these people to survive. So this other story that I wanted to tell you is about a community. I mentioned the role of policy in shaping the livelihoods of people. So in this indigenous community, policies forced a lot of migration. And at one point, people continue sowing maize, but just a little amount. And at one point, there was a hurricane, and they said we had money, but we had no food. And I think I don't have to go really far if we think of COVID, that we all saw the struggles that we had to get access to some of the foods because there was a huge disruption in the market. And then they said it wasn't possible that we could be losing our ability to be self-sufficient. So they started to combine some of their knowledge, what was important for them, the native seeds, because they use a specific maize for some foods, for tortillas, atoles, things that they enjoy. But also they wanted to improve their system. So, for example, they introduced irrigation, and that's how they started to have a knowledge co-production. They also implemented some participatory plant breeding, which is using their own seeds, but making the system more efficient. Also looking to increase the productivity, but still using the different components of the milpa. So yes, it's possible for the different knowledges to coexist. So this is just to show you some of the things that they were doing, using post-harvest techniques, how they were doing the participatory plant breeding. They introduced flowers that they could also sell for a better price in the market and make an income. And then this is also to show you how they compare their seeds. When 2020 came with COVID, they told me they enacted the right to self-determination. They have the own ways of governance. So they could choose to close all the entries of the town. And they said, now we had enough food. We didn't struggle like we did in 2010 when we had a hurricane hitting us. And then we were able to be self-sufficient again. So they come with the idea that being able to feed themselves, it's so essential. And if you can have money, but you cannot develop these strategies to cope with any changes, then you are going to be in a really difficult situation. I want to recall a study that the World Bank did in Latin America, where they documented that 60% of the communities that they surveyed, I don't remember the number of communities, but many of them managed to be self-sufficient and food secure because they were producing food inside the community. And that's what is giving you, or the value of being able to feed yourself. But indigenous peoples are facing so many threats. We say that we are the keepers of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. But I was telling you, for example, that industrial agriculture is responsible for 80% of the world or deforestation. Also, we have learned that every year, at least 220 indigenous defenders or land defenders are killed, and a huge amount of them are indigenous peoples. So what I tell people, especially when I'm talking to audiences like you, is that we have to be really aware as consumers also where whatever that we consuming it's coming from, because it's also having effects in the global south or in some of the areas where we're grabbing our food. We carry water, soil. It might be causing the deforestation of some areas, of some territories. And this is why it's also important to respect the rights of indigenous peoples. So just to mention quickly, because I need to close, some of the work that we're doing at Land is Life. We are working to now in studies to do school meals assessments to see if we can help to put these adequacy lenses to the school feeding programs that we have. We generated a report with the World Food Program last year. I invite you to check it if you want to read it. And because some people ask me, can indigenous peoples feed the world? Well, you can read this report and maybe you can get some insights on that. At Land is Life, we don't believe in intervening, but more in capacity building. It has to be people that leads their own processes. We have to respect the right to self-determination. And we train people, we support indigenous peoples, train them on sustainable practices so they can preserve their native seeds, they can implement sustainable technologies, they can implement seed banks to preserve their seeds, their knowledge. And yeah, that's it, basically what we do. Thank you.